This special presentation was produced in high definition by WEDU, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota.
Coming up next, the new poll shows Governor Scott may be narrowing the gap he has with Charlie Crist. A Southwest Florida conservative congressman admits to buying cocaine. The field is set to replace Bill Young. And the negative press over Obamacare continues to mount. Political Insights next on Florida This Week.
From the WEDU studios, this is Florida This Week. And now, moderator Rob Lorei.
Welcome back. This week our panelists are Bill Bunting is a Republican state committeeman from Pasco County. Barry Edwards is a political strategist and a Democrat. Angie Drobnik-Holan is the editor of PolitiFact. And William March is a political reporter for the Tampa Tribune. Well, thank you all for coming. It's great to have you here. A new poll out this week from Quinnipiac University shows former Governor Charlie Crist ahead of current Governor Rick Scott if the race for governor were held right now. Scott, a Republican, gets a negative 42 to 47% job approval rating. Charlie Crist, who's now a Democrat, gets a 53 to 36% job approval rating for the job he did as governor. Scott tops Democrat Nan Rich 43 to 35%. In a Democratic primary, Crist beats Rich 60 to 12%. The poll found that 53% of Florida voters say Scott does not deserve to be reelected. In the matchup with Crist, Scott takes Republicans 80 to 11%. Crist takes Democrats 86 to 4%. Independent voters go 44% for Crist and only 41% for Scott. Still, Scott's numbers are slightly improved from the last time the poll was taken. So, Bill, is the Republican Party cheering these numbers?
I'm going to meet with the governor on December 6th, but I think they're just preliminary. They're not going to be there. This is going to change as we move into March and April of next year. People are going to realize that Charlie Crist probably never had a real job. I don't know if any besides Morgan & Morgan who wants him to run, where the governor is a businessman, has a balanced budget up in Tallahassee, is bringing job creation, real estate values are up, and I think everything's going to head in that direction, so that's going to turn it around.
Well, Bill, the Republican Party has been airing ads against Charlie Crist the last few weeks, and
good ads, might I say.
And there are also there's quite an internet campaign online from the Republican Party attacking Crist. I don't think we've seen Crist fire back at all yet. But is a Republican?
I beg your pardon. I thought I heard or I read in that paper, Wendy's Tampa Tribune, that he was Al Capone is what he called the governor. Correct me if she's
firing back.
Yeah, I got Angie.
Well, let's talk about that Al Capone remark that Charlie Crist made about Governor Scott. Can you put that in context, Wendy?
Well, it referred to what Crist was referring to was Rick Scott taking the Fifth Amendment, refusing to testify on the grounds of possible self-incrimination in an investigation of misconduct by his health care company. His health care company ended up paying the largest fine in history for Medicare fraud, and Scott has disclaimed responsibility even though he was CEO at the time. When you said Crist hasn't fired back, what you meant, what was the accurate point there is that he hasn't gone up on the air with advertising.
No ads, right.
But then Scott's buy so far has been, and I say Scott's buy, it's not directly by Scott's campaign organization, has been very small.
But is it having an impact? Is that why we see this? Because Scott picked up 3 percentage points since the last Quinnipiac poll. Is it because of the ads, do you think?
It could be, or it could be because of the economy. But polling seems to show something that seems a little odd to people who are in the know. People tend to give credit to a governor rather than to the president or the national administration for the state of the national economy. And there's not a whole lot of rational reason for that, but it does tend to happen. Mm-hmm. The thing that Republicans really love about this poll is that Charlie Crist's personal image, when you ask the voters, is your opinion of Crist favorable, unfavorable, or what, took a big drop. It's now almost even, 41 favorable, 39 unfavorable, and that's That's down from a 16-point positive spread as recently as last March. And what this does is this undercuts the likability factor, the idea that Crist is likable, genteel, Mr. Nice Guy, whereas Rick Scott has a comparatively cold and unapproachable persona.
Well, Angie, is that the way you see these numbers, that they're really headed, albeit slowly, but they're headed in the right direction for the Republicans?
Well, I would just take a bigger picture outlook. We're a year out, so I think a lot of these poll numbers are measuring name recognition. And when we have a sitting governor facing off against a former governor, they both have very high name recognition. Now, overall, I don't think the margin is far enough apart for you to say one of these guys has it in the bag or a commanding lead. So I do think that we need to see the campaign play out. I think we need to see how both of these candidates handle their get out the vote efforts. And then on the issues, we're going to see this big litigation over who's responsible for the recovery. Is it Rick Scott, or is it Charlie Crist would credit it to his friend Barack Obama, or maybe the truth is that the national economy is bigger than any one executive. We keep making this point in our fact checks at PolitiFact.
Yeah. Well, Barry, to that point, the governor had some good news this week. The unemployment rate in the state of Florida went down yet again.
The unemployment rate did go down, and it went down nationwide too. And the economy is improving nationwide. Now, unfortunately, most economists give the credit to the economy to the president and the federal government. Most voters, 2/3 of them, give it to the chief executive. So Scott's getting a benefit there. But I think I'm excited as a Democrat from this poll because what we're seeing is Republicans are going back home to Republicans, Democrats are going back home to Democrats, and the election's going to be won by independents. And Charlie Crist is at 44-41 there. And there's a lot of turmoil right now with the Affordable Health Care Act that's kind of being a damper on some of the independents. But if you ask people about Benghazi or the sequester or the shutdown, people don't even remember what those are, and those were 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. So in 4 months, when the Affordable Health Care Act is dealt with and we're on a neutral playing field, these independents are going to continue to shift for Charlie Crist. Because I think what's important, even with the economy giving credit to Rick Scott, 51% of people in Florida think the state's on the wrong track, and only 48% think it's on the right track. And as a sports analogy that the governor's own chief of staff said, if it's halftime and you're giving a speech, would you be happy? And the answer is no. It's always better to be up than down. And so the governor's got to make up 7 points over a ex-governor, Charlie Crist. So I think we're in good shape.
But, Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, but there's something you're overlooking, Barry, and that is how many of these independents are going to lose their health coverage and not going to have their contracts, as the president says, you can keep it, if you have it. And that's going to happen. And the more independents that lose health coverage are going to be really upset when they have to take a pocketbook issue, spend a lot of money, and may not get the coverage they already had.
Well, those independents are going to get health care coverage. They may have a small percentage, which is, if you're one of those small percentage, it's like the starfish getting tossed back into the sea, you're upset about it. But it's a small percentage, and it's going to be resolved. And if the Republican Party would try to work together with the Democratic Party to fix things and do what's good for the government, then we'd be better off.
We are going to talk about the Affordable Care Act a little bit later on in the program. I'm also interested in the same poll in the numbers about marijuana, medical marijuana. It seems to have huge approval by a 4-to-1 margin in the state of Florida. Now, is that good news for Charlie Crist? Is there a link between John Morgan, Charlie Crist boss, and medical marijuana?
Well, there's a lot of assertion of that, Rob. The idea being John Morgan, the Uber lawyer, the super lawyer in Orlando, is financing this push to put the medical marijuana ballot on the amendment. Now, some people contend that he's doing that in order to draw out, young voters, presumably young toke-happy voters.
Lean Democrat.
Is
that the strategy, and is that going to work?
Probably not. It's probably not the strategy, and it's probably not going to work. People nationwide, at the national level, marijuana law reformers say that a move to legalize marijuana does tend to draw out young college-type voters, but a move to legalize only medical use of marijuana has far less effect than that. I did a story about this a few months ago and interviewed several national-level marijuana law reformers. And they said that in states where medical use was the only topic on the ballot, they did not see any significant turnout advantage as a result.
Fair.
And I think also when you have 70% of Republicans are for this, 88% of Democrats, and 80-some% of independents, that it's so overwhelming that if you're a college student and you look at the paper and you know it's going to pass, you don't have to go out and vote because it's a foregone conclusion. So I think the fact that it's so overwhelming is going to be kind of a damper on that.
You know, and one of the things I noticed in that marijuana report or poll is that there's a gender gap there. And it's a gender gap in that men favor the move towards more liberalization of marijuana laws than women do. All right. Well, freshman Congressman Trey Radel, who represents the Fort Myers-Naples area, pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of possessing 3.5 grams of cocaine this week. He was arrested last month in Washington, D.C. by undercover police. Radel was sentenced to 1 year's probation. He's undergoing treatment and has indicated to Republican Party leaders that he plans to return to Congress after the first of the year. The freshman lawmaker apologized and said he's been struggling with alcoholism and substance abuse off and on for years. He's donating his salary to charity. Radel has been a moderate on drug laws for offenders, but did support making food stamp recipients undergo mandatory drug tests. And Angie, how is this playing with the Tea Party crowd, the family values crowd that got him elected?
Well, let's talk about Connie Mack IV. He's the former congressman for this district. He left the seat to run against Bill Nelson last year, but he lost. So he put out a statement that was fairly sympathetic to Radel, who he had supported in the general election, and said it was premature to talk about the politics of this, that he needed to get help. But you have to think that Connie Mack is looking at this race. You know, this arrest was last month. This was not like years ago.
Why was it kept secret for so long? Do we have? Has anybody reported on that yet?
Yeah, our reporter in Washington, Alex Leary, has been reporting on this. I don't think it was kept secret, but I just think it took a while for people to notice. His first name isn't what he goes by, but it was going to come out, and it's a very significant charge. I mean, we're talking about active drug use while in office, not something from years ago.
Bill, in terms of the family values of the Republican Party, how does this play with those voters within the Republican Party who make up a huge part of the core of the Republicans?
It doesn't play well with the family values, and the Tea Party is going to get burnt on this one, certainly if Connie Mack jumps into the race. But to Angie's point, Alex is up there and he sees what's going on. I mean, we had a crack-smoking mayor that stayed in office up there that was a Democrat, didn't we?
Well, that's right, the mayor of Washington for a while.
I think this is important. We should be sympathetic to him, and he has been moderate on most of his policies, but he wasn't moderate on public assistance on food stamps, and they would have lost it if they had tested positive. So there's a little hypocrisy here, whereas he wanted them to lose their public assistance. Now, he is donating his salary. But I think we need to look at also for smart justice, which is really a bigger issue. If he had happened in Florida, he could have been facing 5 years in prison as a convicted felon, losing his right to vote, right to hold office, and all his other civil rights. So there's a great disparity between the different political localities. D.C., it's a misdemeanor. Here it's a felony. So maybe we ought to look at the broader picture. If it's all right for him just to go get treatment in D.C., why isn't it all right for all these people in Florida to get arrested not to be able to get treatment?
Well, that's a great point. Is there, well, you don't agree with that, Bill?
No, I don't agree with that because you're talking about states that choose states' rights, and that's why you have governors and states, and people look up to that, and they can live any place in the country that they choose to live. And that's the reason why.
All right.
If they like drugs, they can go to D.C.
But the one way you can balance your budget is and spend more money on education and infrastructure is to have less people incarcerated. And last month, the governor asked for more money to build more prisons.
Is there any pressure on Congressman Radel to step down? Right now, he's in a treatment abuse center. He's getting treatment for his substance abuse.
Yes, there is.
And where is that pressure coming from?
Well, initially at least, one person who's called for his resignation is Paige Kriegel, who ran in the primary for this congressional seat that Trey Radel won. Mm-hmm. I think you'll see more people who will call for his resignation. Quite likely, they may be people who are backing others who might want to compete to take the nomination, compete in a primary with Radel to get the nomination to unseat him if he stays in office. So far you're seeing Republican leaders, including, best I know, the Tea Party organizations, haven't piped up much yet. John Boehner said it's between Radel and his constituents. I haven't seen any Tea Party organizations clamoring for his resignation.
The reason it will, Wendy, is that family values and your kids, you don't want your kids to look up at a role model that's doing drugs in office, no matter what party it's in.
Well, I think there's going to be calls for his resignation. And so far, they're only from the folks who have a political interest.
Okay. Well, it's now official. 6 candidates will try to replace the late Congressman Bill Young in a special election next year in Pinellas County. The Republicans are Mark Bircher, David Jolly, and State Representative Kathleen Peters. The primary is in a little more than 7 weeks. The winner will then face 3 candidates in the general election in March: Democrat Alex Sink, Libertarian Lucas Overby, and write-in candidate Michael S. Levinson. This is a closely watched race because it's thought to be an indicator of the national mood heading into the 2014 midterm elections. The Pinellas County seat is located in a swing voting district that President Obama carried in 2008 and 2012, but for many years that seat was held by a Republican, Congressman Bill Young, who was first elected in 1970 and held that seat until his death a few weeks ago. Wendy, is this a pretty strong field? I mean, do voters have a lot of choice given the range of the 6 candidates?
Yeah, they've got some pretty strong choices. The 3 leading candidates, Democrat Alex Sink, Republicans Kathleen Peters and David Jolly, those are all 3 very solid candidates. Any one of them is competent to be a congressman. For the Republican side, it's not the best candidate. It's not the field that they wanted. They wanted a field of 1 so they wouldn't have a primary battle, and they wanted that to be Rick Baker. So the Republican field is weaker than they wanted, but both sides have problems here. On the Republican side, the problems are that they've got a primary fight and that their 2 candidates are not as well known as Alex Sink. On the Democratic side, Sink's problem is her residence outside the district, before, at least until she's about to move.
The news this week is she's renting instead of buying in Pinellas County.
Instead of buying a home in Pinellas County, apparently she's going to rent one, and her other problem is that she will run with the problems of the Affordable Care Act fresh in the minds of voters. She won't have the advantage of what Barry was talking about if those problems get sorted out by November. She doesn't have until November. She has to run in March.
Angie, I wonder about the dynamics that Kathleen Peters, a state representative, gets in pretty late into the game, and by all indications it is State Senator Jack Latvala who's backing her. Also, the Young family seems to be split, with some members of the Young family supporting David Jolly, some supporting Kathleen Peters. Why is the party so divided?
You know, I think that these are 2 fairly different candidates. David Jolly has a lot of Washington experience. He's a former lobbyist. Peters is more of a kind of a hometown person. Now, I would say that's all generally speaking, because Jolly also has been familiar with Pinellas County issues for a long time. So I don't want to make it sound too stark, but it's just that I think the main candidate that they wanted didn't get in, and so Rick Baker. Yeah. So now you're seeing like these choices between the 2 different people. Now I will say, because the primary is in January, I think we'll probably see low turnout. But I would expect all of the voters who do bother to show up are going to be pretty well informed and make their decision.
And Barry, can you describe what the dynamics within the Republican Party? I mean, because you know some of the players in the Pinellas County Republican Party. What are the dynamics, or why the split?
I think it's almost like the Republican Party on the national level or the state level. You have the Tea Party anti-establishment, and then you have the establishment. David Jolly is definitely the establishment. He was the preferred candidate for Congressman Young, and Congressman Young's wife is supporting him, and Ambassador Sembler, the largest Republican fundraiser in the country. But you also have kind of a dynamic. Senator Latvala, I think, it appears at least, wants to kind of replace Congressman Young as the granddaddy of Pinellas Republican politics. So he got his candidate in. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic works. But I think I think there's a power role, and it's the North County people versus the South County people.
Bill, is that the way you see it?
Well, I see it pretty much like Angie called it. David Jolly's an insider out of D.C., but we have beach property in Madeira Beach, and I'll tell you, Kathleen Peters is a very popular young lady. And I think what's going to determine this vote, too, money, of course, is going to be the influential piece, but women voting. How many women come out to vote in this primary is going to make a significant difference.
I think the get out the vote efforts in this race are going to be key. And we are already seeing that national interest in our local races. I think you saw a lot of party interest in the St. Petersburg mayor's race that we just had, officially nonpartisan, and the Senate race in Pasco. We saw that there was national interest there.
House race.
I'm sorry, House race.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, the national parties are all looking at this race. I mean, this is on the radar of the national parties, so they're going to try to nationalize it as much as they can.
So Obamacare versus something like the Tea Party.
Well, in the Amanda Murphy race up in Pasco, which was very interesting, the Republican turnout was higher than the Democratic turnout, and it looks like most of the Republicans voted for Gunter, most of the Democrats voted for Amanda Murphy, but it was the independents that voted 2-1 for Amanda Murphy that put her in office. And I think what's interesting here is you have a Libertarian candidate on the ballot who supports medical marijuana, and you have the medical marijuana is going to be looming more and more by then. Is that going to draw off if he makes it an issue?
Okay. Well, the Guardian newspaper reported this week that secret conversations are taking place in Florida between healthcare stakeholders and the legislature that will most likely lead to the Republican-controlled legislature accepting Medicaid expansion money.
Some health professionals believe the amount of federal money and the fact that the Republican Party benefits from campaign contributions by health insurance companies means that Florida is likely to find a way to take the funding provided by the Affordable Care Act. For Democrats, it was a glimmer of good news following weeks of negative stories about the Affordable Care Act and the broken promises made by the president.
Barry, one of the Quinnipiac polls this week, the president's numbers here in Florida had fallen pretty dramatically, and a lot of people are attributing the failure, at least the first few months since the rollout of Obamacare, the failure for it to get any good press.
Absolutely, but I think but reality is starting to set in. It's why you're having these secret negotiations. Is the Medicaid expansion is $50 billion over 10 years, and it's not additional tax money. It's our tax money that Bill Bunting and I paid that was sent to D.C. and in a federal system should have gone back to Florida, but it's going to California or Texas. So I think the Republicans in the legislature are finally realizing that we're spending the money anyway. Let's get our fair share back.
Bill, do you think, I mean...
That'll help the president and everyone else.
I think our reporter colleagues around the table would say that Guardian newspaper story was very thin because it didn't quote anybody in the state legislature, so we're not sure. What's your take? Well, is there a move in the state legislature to take
I'm an insider, and I'm on the state executive board, and I haven't heard of it. If it's been there, it's been a pretty well-kept secret. I don't know if they're going to jump into this at this point or not. Barry makes a point that, you know, the money would be coming back into the state, but most of the Republicans that I know, like the House Speaker, Will Weatherford, and Christopher coming in, are not the kind of people that want this money, and they control the House.
They're standing firm.
And Bill, the last time I spoke to them, they're standing firm.
Well, we were talking about the Affordable Care Act a moment ago. You're pretty convinced that this is going to be a negative story for the Democrats going right up until November of 2014.
And I think so because more people are going to lose their health coverage, and they're not going to be happy when they see what I'm hearing on the street is people that are losing their policies and what they have to lay out of pocket and not get the coverage they had. They're not happy about the promise that Obama made.
All right, we're going to track this for the next year. Before we go, we ask our panel members to tell us about one more major story for the past week. Sorry, Barry, what's your other big story?
I think the big story, and it's been in the news all day today. Today is 50 years since President Kennedy was assassinated, and 50 years in a couple weeks from when he came to Tampa. And I think if politicians would step back and think of big ideas, in the month of June, he gave a speech at American University about the Cold War that helped reset that, Berlin on the communism, and on the 11th of June on civil rights. If our local politicians would get big ideas and be reckless of self, maybe they would have legacies like President Kennedy.
William, your other big story?
Well, I'm going to have to go with the governor, Rick Scott, on his short list for appointment as his new lieutenant governor to replace Jennifer Carroll, who resigned, is Tom Lee, state senator from Brandon, and Sandy Merman, Hillsborough County commissioner from Tampa. Lee is probably the number one the top person on that short list, although no one can be certain of these things. But there is a question whether he'll accept it if it's offered. He has personal and professional and possibly some political reasons not to accept it. And if he doesn't accept it, it could be a public relations black eye for Scott.
All right, Angie, your other big story.
My big story is the filibuster changes that were going on in the U.S. Senate this week. Essentially, we have a really gridlocked Congress, and the Democrats in the Senate said we're tired of not getting Obama's judicial nominations through. So they changed the rules, it was very historic, and said that they were only going to need 50 votes to get these judges seated. So, and as you may expect, our Democratic Senator Nelson supported the changes, and Senator Rubio did not.
Mm-hmm. All right, Bill, your other big story.
Mine's a Pasco story. The mayor of Zephyr Hills, Danny Burgess, young man, we had him elected at 18 to a city council over there, and the St. Pete Times went nuts, just so you know that. And
Nuts in a good way or a bad way?
Well, CT, he got over it. But he's going to jump in to run for Will Weatherford seat. There's no question about that. And we got a young man, Michael Moore, that's going to run for county commission. And then today's posting on the blogs, former Representative Littlefield says, I'm jumping into a Republican primary, ? We don't know which one. He lives in the, he lives in the commission seat and the House seat. So now
some news there, Bill. Bill, thanks a lot. Angie, thank you. Wendy, thank you. And Barry, thank you. And thank you for watching Florida This Week. We want to hear from you. You can record a comment on our toll-free line. It's 1-800-335-9338. Or write us at ftw@wedu.org. And you can watch the show online on the wedu.org website beginning Monday morning. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 and Sunday afternoon at 12:30. And from all of us here at WEDU, have a happy Thanksgiving.
Florida This Week is a production of WEDU, who is solely responsible for its content.